This video tells the story of the transfer of the remains of Napoleon II from Vienna to Paris, which took place in December 1940, 6 months after Germany's victory over France. However, it is also an example of how, particularly in later French and English reports, the use of contemporary propaganda gave readers the impression that, despite the minimal planning and execution of the transfer, France had in fact won a huge victory, while Germany had suffered a major defeat. To put the situation into context, here are the historical facts and background information. There is probably no one who has not heard of Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte, who is highly revered in France and also enjoys a certain popularity in Germany, where his supporters like to refer to the laws he enacted. He himself recognized his German roots when, as a terminally ill man on St. Helena, he wrote, "Had heaven willed that I had been born a German prince, and had they once elected and proclaimed me their emperor, it seems to me even today that they would never have deserted me, and I would not now be sitting here." Indeed, one can agree with what the great German mystic Christian Morgenstern had said about him in the book Stufen, published in 1918. Napoleon was a force of nature. To revile him as a brutal butcher is no different than to call an earthquake a gross nuisance or a thunderstorm a public disturbance. But of course, Napoleon was also a top-tier power politician. Many called him a dictator who ravaged Europe with numerous battles and revealed his political agenda to the French ambassador in Tuscany, Maillot de Melito. Do you perhaps believe that I want to establish a democracy? What a thought! The nation needs a leader who has risen to prominence through glory, but not theories about government, not grand words, not speeches about ideologies that the French don't understand. Give them hobby horses, that's enough for them. They will amuse themselves with it and let themselves be led, if only one cleverly conceals the goal to which one is marching them. And something else that is often forgotten today came from him, namely the infamous decree issued in 1808, the so-called shameful decree. In it, he had abolished the freedom of movement and free economic activity of the Jews, and also suspended their civil rights in important respects. As a result, for almost half a century, the existence and economic activity of Jews in the German states he had conquered and occupied were significantly and often severely affected. Napoleon, who lived non-monogamously, had relationships and children with multiple mistresses. His only legitimate child, Napoleon Franz Bonaparte, born in Paris on March 20th, 1811, came from his marriage to Marie-Louise of Austria, concluded in Vienna on March 11th, 1810. However, Napoleon had been represented at the wedding celebrations by Charles of Austria-Teschen, Marie-Louise's uncle. The 19-year-old did not meet her new husband until March 27th in Paris, where the church wedding took place on April 2nd. When her son, Napoleon Franz Bonaparte, was born on March 20th, 1811, he received the title of King of Rome. When Napoleon I suffered a devastating defeat in the Battle of Waterloo in June 1815 and abdicated in favor of his son, the 4-year-old Napoleon Franz was recognized by the government still appointed by his father as Napoleon II, Emperor of the French. However, this only lasted from June 22nd to July 7th, coming to an end on July 8th with the restoration of the monarchy by Louis XVIII. While his father lived in exile on the island of St. Helena until his death on May 5th, 1821, the child king of Rome was taken to Vienna, a city he never loved, where he was not even allowed to bear his father's name, but was instead given the operatic title of Duke of Reichstadt in 1818. In Vienna, Napoleon Franz was educated in German, French, Italian, and mathematics. At the age of 8, he then decided to pursue a career as an officer. In 1823, at the age of 12, he joined the Austrian army as a cadet, with his evaluations describing him as intelligent, serious, and focused. Also, at the age of 17, he had already reached an unusual height for that time of 1.80 meters. However, his budding military career had caused some concern among the monarchies of Europe and leading French politicians with regard to his possible return to France. The influential Austrian state chancellor, Clemens Wenzel Lothar von Metternich, born in Koblenz in 1773, made sure that Franz Napoleon, who had to live in Vienna, didn't play any political role, but was only allowed to shine with his presence during talks with French representatives. Out of concern that someone from the Bonaparte family might regain political power, Metternich even rejected Franz's request, who was already struggling with lung health problems at an early age, to move from the inhospitable Vienna to Italy with its warmer climate. Finally, his grandfather, the Austrian Emperor Franz I, also denied him entry as an active officer in the army. And after his stepfather, Adam Albert von Nyberg, died in February 1829, who was his mother, Marie-Louise's early lover, and had been married to her since Napoleon I's death in 1821, the completely lonely Franz Napoleon in Vienna found out that his mother had given birth to 2 illegitimate children in the concubinage with Nyberg that preceded the marriage. This led to a further estrangement between Franz and his mother, who had not cared much for him since his birth. All of this had ultimately led Napoleon Franz to the conviction that the Austrian part of his family was doing everything to sideline him to avoid international political controversies. In 1813, he had confided completely depressed to his friend Anton von Prokesch-Osten, referring to Napoleon's first wife and Empress of the French, Josephine de Beauharnais. If Josephine had been my mother, my father would not have been buried on St. Helena, and I would not have been in Vienna. My mother is kind but weak. She was not the woman my father deserved. In 1833, at the age of 20, Franz had received the command of the 60th Hungarian Battalion, stationed in the Vienna Ulcer Barracks as an honorary colonel. But in the meantime, his lung problems had worsened more and more. After contracting tuberculosis in 1832 and being bedridden for several months, he died at 5 o'clock in the morning on July 22nd at the age of 21. In the room at Schönbrunn Palace, where his father, after his victorious battle at Wagram on the 5th and 6th of July, 1809 against the Austrian army, dreamed of new European power and new victories. Napoleon Franz remained unmarried and did not leave any heirs. Therefore, the Napoleonic claim to the throne of France had passed to his uncle Joseph Bonaparte, the brother of Napoleon I, and later to his cousin Louis-Napoleon Bonaparte. He founded the Second French Empire with the coup of December 2nd, 1858, then declared himself dictator and henceforth referred to as Napoleon III. After the demise of the young Napoleon Franz, the body was preserved and interred in the imperial crypt beneath the Capuchin Church in Vienna. In accordance with the customary funeral ceremony at the Viennese court, his heart was buried in the so-called Heart Crypt in St. Stephen's Cathedral. Afterwards, there had been repeated attempts to bring him back to Paris. First in 1852 by Napoleon III. However, Austria's Emperor Franz Joseph III rejected the request on the grounds that the Duke of Reichstadt was a member of the Habsburg dynasty and should remain so. The idea of repatriation had then been revived in France after the First World War, so it was by no means just a German idea, but had already been planned by France 90 years earlier. Back to Napoleon I. He died on May 5, 1821, 11 years before his son, in exile on St. Helena, and was buried there on May 9th. But already 19 years later, in 1840, his mortal remains were exhumed, loaded onto the frigate Belle Poule at night, then brought to France and transferred to the Invalides in Paris on December 15th, and placed there in a crypt. 100 years later, in the summer of 1940, France had just experienced the greatest military disaster in its history. For in just 6 weeks and 3 days, from May 10th to the armistice that came into effect on June 25th, 1940, the German Wehrmacht had defeated the French troops and their allies, who were clearly superior in terms of divisions, soldiers, guns, tanks, aircraft, and trucks. While the southern half of France remained unoccupied for the time being, where the government under the war hero of the First World War, Marshal of France Philippe Pétain, had established itself in the city of Vichy, the north had been militarily occupied, after which a relatively normal life developed in Paris, as it did in Germany after the occupation by the Allies in 1945. From August 1940, the Francophile Otto Abetz was the ambassador of the German Reich to the French government in Vichy, with his office in the Palais Beauharnais in Paris, which is still the residence of the German ambassador in France today. As early as 1938, as managing director of the German-French Society, which had been newly founded in 1935, Abetz had pursued the idea of bringing Napoleon's son from Vienna to Paris in order to possibly put the German Reich, which was viewed with suspicion by the French, in a better light. However, the political climate in the politically complicated year of 1938 had proven to be unfavorable for this. Now, after the German victory over France, it was the French journalist Félicien Fayet, who later also wrote for German propaganda, who had brought up the topic with Abetz and had received approval. The 100th anniversary of his father's repatriation, Saturday, December 15, 1940, had then been set for the repatriation of Napoleon II. Ambassador Abetz is said to have planned a grand ceremony in the presence of Hitler, Göring, and Marshal Pétain, but this is a legend, as all three had other things to do in December 1940 than attend a ceremony with a monarchist background for a few minutes. Neither Hitler nor Göring were seen at the funeral of the emperor's grandson, Prince Wilhelm, in 1940, nor were they seen at the funeral of the last German emperor in Dorn, Holland, in 1941. As for the 84-year-old Pétain, with all due respect, most French people couldn't care less about Franz Joseph Bonaparte, King of Rome, who had only spent the first 5 years of his life in France. Rumor had it that the ceremony was also attended by the foreign minister of the Vichy regime, Pierre Laval, who was executed in France on the 15th of October, 1945, for collaborating with the Germans. Unlike head of state Pétain, this French politician had repeatedly called for comprehensive cooperation with the National Socialist German Reich. There are different and contradictory reports for the days leading up to the event. According to one account, Otto Abetz informed Pierre Laval of the deportation he had allegedly planned in the presence of Pétain, but Laval's opponents in the Vichy government prevented this by all means, as they would have seen a meeting with Hitler, as had already happened on October 24, 1940, in the town of Montoire, as merely another humiliation for Pétain, and thus also for the Vichy government. Therefore, and although Hitler had written him a personal letter, the 84-year-old marshal did not go to Paris, but instead removed Laval from the office of foreign minister and placed him under house arrest. However, this is not entirely accurate, as Laval had been dismissed on December 13, 1940, following controversy with Pétain, who saw him as the organizer of the October meeting between Hitler and Pétain, and believed it to be the beginning of a German-French alliance against Great Britain. Pétain was merely concerned with securing the state sovereignty of France and preserving the colonial empire. After everything we have just heard, the following version, which has also been handed down, is probably the most coherent. According to this version, Jacques-Benoît Méchain, a historian who had openly sympathized with Hitler and National Socialism before the war, announced in a personal telegram Germany's intention to return the remains of Napoleon's son to France on the 100th anniversary of the return of Napoleon's ashes, so that they could rest with him under the protection of the emperor. Marshal Pétain then expressed his gratitude and that of the French people in writing, after which all further communications from the German side were kept secret until the last moment. And only the day before, a few hand-picked Parisian journalists had received an invitation to come to the German embassy at 11 p.m. without being given any further details. But not because, as French and English reports claimed, the Germans feared that the event would be a flop for the Parisians, but precisely because of the opposite. For the National Socialist leadership, which was known to be hostile to the nobility, had not forgotten what had happened in Potsdam at the funeral of the eldest grandson of Kaiser Wilhelm II, Prince Wilhelm of Prussia, who had fallen as a lieutenant of the reserve in the France field. For although the public had not been informed of the death of the extremely popular folkloric prince, on the day of the funeral, about 50,000 people dressed in black lined the streets of Potsdam as a tribute to the German monarchy. This largest unorganized mass demonstration during Hitler's reign had prompted him to proclaim the prince's decree, which initially forbade the members of former German ruling houses from serving on the front, and from 1943 onwards generally prohibited them from serving in the Wehrmacht. Imagine if the return of Napoleon II had been carried out with great fanfare on the German side. The last thing the German occupation forces in Paris would have needed was a crowd of hundreds of thousands of French people waving tricolor flags, because that would clearly have also become a demonstration against the German occupation. After the relatively minor planning was completed, the time had come. On the late evening of December 14, 1940, a Saturday, Special Train 392 from Vienna arrived at track 26 of the Paris North Station. It had stopped in front of the small honor guard of the Wehrmacht, lined up on the platform, so that the baggage car attached to the end of the train came to a halt directly in front of them. Then at 05, soldiers from a tank hunter unit hoisted the heavy bronze sarcophagus out of the car with the help of poles and loaded it onto a gun carriage, which was attached to a tractor standing ready at the station, a so-called Special Motor Vehicle 251. Then the small convoy, accompanied by scrap metal detectors, set off southwards, driving along the Boulevard de Strasbourg, then the Boulevard de Sebastopol, past the remains of the Tuileries Palace, where Napoleon Franz was born and which had been set on fire by the insurgents during the Paris Commune uprising in May 1871. Then along the Seine to the Invalides' Dome, in front of which a group of uniformed and civilian French dignitaries were waiting. And again, contrary to French and British reports, these were not hastily summoned subordinates, but virtually the cream of French military and civilian life in Paris, who now awaited the arrival of Napoleon II, illuminated by torches carried by members of the Republican Guard, on the promenade in front of the dome of the Invalides. Among them was Admiral Francois Darlan, who, after Laval's dismissal on the 13th of December 1940, was appointed by Pétain as Minister of Foreign Affairs, Interior, and War, and who fell victim to an assassination in French North African Algiers on the 24th of December 1942. Four-star Army General Émile Lourdes, Secretary-General of Pétain's office since November 15, 1940. Brigadier General Benoît de la Laurencie, Pétain's representative in Paris, and finally Roger Langeron, Chief of Police in Paris from 1934 to 1941. After the column had arrived around 1:20 a.m., illuminated by the torches of the Republican Guards and Ambassador Abetz, as well as the military commander of Paris, General Otto von Stülpnagel, had left their vehicles. 2 minutes later, the tractor with the sarcophagus on the carriage had also arrived. After a short speech by Abetz, to which Admiral Darlan replied, "Thank you for returning our Emperor's son to us," members of the Garde Républicaine police unit then took the heavy bronze coffin, now decorated with a large tricolor flag, on their shoulders and carried it through the row of torches into the Saint-Jérôme Chapel, where Napoleon's coffin had originally been placed. Another post-war invention is the tall tale found in a book published in 2008. Hitler had sent a large wreath to the Dome of the Invalides, ribbon text from Chancellor Hitler to the Duke of Reichstadt, which was, however, destroyed there by the wife of a veteran employed at the Dome. Such a wreath, if it existed at all, would not have been sent to the Dome of the Invalides by registered mail via the French Postal Service and delivered there against signature by the wife of an employee, but would have been brought and laid down by the commander participating in the ceremony, General Otto von Stülpnagel. The nocturnal ceremony in front of a further number of French dignitaries was concluded with a short church service accompanied by organ music. Here is Fernand de Brignon, representative of the Vichy government in Paris, who was executed as a collaborator in France on the 15th of April 1947. Meanwhile, the German commando unit had left, and soon after the French also left the scene, nothing remained of the virtually secret nighttime German-French operation, except for numerous traces in the freshly fallen snow. In December 1969, for some reason, it was decided in Paris to move the mortal remains of Napoleon II to the so-called cella, the basement cell of Napoleon's tomb, the closed part of the gallery, where now only a tombstone with an inscription reminds of him. Napoleon II, King of Rome, 1811 to 1832. His heart still rests in Vienna.